morning and good afternoon from wherever you're joining today's webinar, Rethinking Rework, presented by FlexXray. We know that you're busy and we're thankful that you're taking the time to learn about this important issue and how it can affect your business and your ability to meet goals and objectives. Today, we'll be talking broadly and specifically about foreign material contamination, where it occurs, why it occurs, and how manufacturers like you can address it when it happens. Leading today's webinar are our two expert panelists, Suzanne Finstad and Seth Miller. Suzanne Finstad is the Vice President of Food Safety and Quality Assurance at Tyson Foods. She brings over 26 years of experience to our conversation today from her experience at Tyson, where she develops and implements strategies, policies, and programs to ensure regulatory and specification compliance. She served as a member and chair in a variety of industry and leadership organizations, and we're excited to bring her knowledge to today's presentation. Seth Miller is the Director of Operations for FlexXray and brings a decade of experience in food safety to today's discussion. After serving as a member of the Ohio Air National Guard as a crew chief on a C-130, he worked as a supervisor and later production manager at Kraft Heinz. In his role as Director of Operations at FlexXray, he oversees operations at their nationwide network of facilities. We're excited to hear from these two experts today. If you have questions about the material presented, we encourage you to ask those questions in the question panel at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of today's presentation. At the end of the presentation, FlexXray's Director of Marketing, William Weichelt, will be giving a very brief synopsis about our presenting sponsor, FlexXray. Without further ado, let's get started with today's webinar.
Hello, good day. So today's objectives for Rethinking Rework, we're going to define what rework is. We're going to break it down into the 5 main causes of rework. And Suzanne's going to present how you can rethink foreign material rework. And then we're going to move over to some common rework causes that are found across the food industry. So rework, what is it? Rework is really just a general term given to any unincorporated or unused product within a food manufacturing process that's going to require additional work or processing to make that product sellable for you. There are infinite causes of rework, but they can be kind of lumped into 5 main groups. First being issues with supplies or ingredients, so supplier-related holds that could cause rework for you. Second, any innate rework to a manufacturing process or something that is a natural part of the process. Third would be a mechanical failure or malfunction of equipment that could potentially put foreign material over a product contact surface. Going forth, more generally, foreign material found in the product could be anything outside of the mechanical break realm. And then finally, a failed or missed quality check that would result in needing to rework the product back through the quality system. So moving right into it, the 5 main causes of rework with more detail. So a supplier caused rework or hold, this could be due to any ingredient or packaging material that is out of spec or contaminated. So this could be very easily solved if you were notified right away. Where the concern comes in is if you weren't notified right away and you found out that you had out of spec material from your supplier after you already used the supplies or ingredients. So what would you do then? Second, talking about rework that is a natural part of the manufacturing process. So this is rework is just part of the process, something that you're dealing with day in and day out. Depending on what the product is and what you're making will really determine the outcome of this style of rework. Given the example of utilizing a slicer in the meat industry, where you have a gripper that grabs the butt end of the log and then it feeds it to the slicer, you have a good chunk of meat left over that turns into be rework. That same thing happens within the cheese industry with that same piece of equipment. But in the cheese industry, that rework is very easily consumed in shredded cheese or be able to melt back into the process. Whereas in the meat industry, it's much harder to use. Third, let's talk about mechanical and equipment failures. So when a piece of machinery breaks and could potentially put foreign material into your product, how can this product be saved? Do you have end of the line detection? Is it possible to see all of the contaminants that could be in your product? If so, what is the detection level? And what do you do next? Moving on to the fourth category of foreign material, there are countless sources of foreign material outside of mechanical failures for all of our processes. It can be from human error to just anything from packaging materials getting into your product. So think of human error or tools being left online, as well as PPE gone broken or missing, bone from protein processing being left in something that is considered boneless, or think about glass in the bottling industry. If one of the bottles breaks, how do you verify that there's not glass in any of the surrounding containers? Then the last category we like to talk about today is going to be failed or missed quality checks. A failed or missed quality check can result in many things, but mostly it'll result in a hold for you on which the product will need to be reworked or at least rechecked to validate that your process is safe. So if it's a CCP failure within your HACCP plan, very serious hold that will require it to be ran back through the CCP if possible. Finding the bookends on this and determining how big of a hold might be easier than any of the previous examples we talked about, being that you can go from good check to good check, but then understanding what is your risk and if the product is salvageable. Next, I would like to turn it over to Suzanne to talk about rethinking rework and the process of foreign material.
Thanks, Seth. You did a great job of setting that up, all the reasons why we might do rework. But as Joe mentioned in the intro, we're going to focus today on foreign material, which is certainly cause for concern for all of us in our various industries. So before we really get into the meat of the rework, let's level set on a little bit of terminology. So there's two reasons why we might find ourselves in a foreign material situation. The first one is an event. This is exactly what it sounds like. Something happens in the process. Likely it's a known something that causes concern that you might have introduced a contaminant into the product. Examples of this might include some type of malfunction. Maybe you've ground something up in your process, lost personal protective equipment. It could be any one of a number of things. The alternate is a simple finding. And so this is when foreign material is just simply discovered in the process. It's, I like to call it, it's either a stumble on or an I spy type of situation where you found something in your product, or maybe your customer has found something in your product. We've got, of course, a variety of exclusion devices in most of our processes. And so I would say when you have a finding at that exclusion device, it's not necessarily indicative of an event. It's not necessarily indicative of a finding. It may just be that that's why you have it in place to collect any incidental things that pass through your process for whatever reason. It's functioning as it's supposed to. However, recognize that there's a crossover point where you have enough of those little findings that may indicate to you that you're in the middle of an event. And so when we think about we've had an incident, whether it's an event or a finding, and what makes the difference between spiraling out of control, maybe getting into a really public, an unfortunate event for our companies, or good control of the situation. And it's really how you respond in the moment. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. So the first thing that you want to do is control the product. And I'd recommend that you cast a wide net to get as, you may want to overkill on this one. It's certainly much easier to release product on the back end than it is to try to get your arms around stuff that's gotten away from you. So that's number one. You also, if you don't know what the cause of your situation is, you want to consider all of the components of the product. So anything that went into it, whether that's food or whether it's not food, may be a source for the situation that we have. Consider all of the possibilities, which might include missing tools, parts, personal protective equipment, the unfortunate intentional act. We hope that doesn't happen, but it's a possibility in our businesses, whether it's an isolated finding or whether it's a systemic situation. And then lotting really is the key to this, because you want to make sure that you've captured enough material to really contain the problem. And so you want to ask yourself, is this situation limited to where I've discovered it, or are other processes impacted? And you really want to think about that inclusive of your raw materials, because I know certainly in my business, a lot of times my ingredient supplier lots are much much bigger and much different than what I would call my lot. And then you really want to find the bookends. So when did this start? When did this stop? And stop the bleeding. You want to really recognize the danger in continuing to produce suspect product. You're really just compounding your problem at that point. So diving deeper into finding the bookends and how we might do that, you first need to consider whether you know when the incident occurred or when it could have occurred. Timing is important. What do you know versus what do you not know? And what might be able to help you know what you know? Could you use video monitoring? Is that available where you can go back and review the process and determine exactly what happened? Do you have equipment checks that you can refer to that would tell you what that equipment's integrity was and when? Maybe employee interviews. I promise you, no one knows more about what's going on the processing floor than the people that are actually out there doing the work. Think about your process timing, start to finish, whether you're batching, whether you're going, cleanup to cleanup, whatever that looks like for you. You want to know how long it takes for material to flow through your process so that can help you capture what the affected lot might be. And then consider any catch or collection points, because we're talking today about something that happens in the moment and the rework associated with that. But you might have rework for different reasons coming off your process at any point in time, and you don't want to let that get away. And then if all else fails and you don't know, if you can't answer any of the above questions, back to the last acceptable check is always a pretty safe bet. So once we've done that, we've captured all the product, we don't have to worry about it getting away from us. The next thing to think about is, what do we know about the material, or what do we know about the situation? Are we dealing with a hazard? Is the object something that presents a choking or an injury hazard? And to do that, make that determination, you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. Very important. What's the intended use of the product? Who's the target audience? How are they going to consume it? Are they going to have opportunity to really look it over and see what's happening before they ingest it or not? What's the size of this material that we're concerned about? And, we've got a reference here of 7 to 25 millimeters that's considered hazardous for most of the population, but understand that if you're targeting a special risk group, children, elderly, hospital or care facilities, that might be, you might need to worry about smaller sizes in that hazard determination. You want to consider the shape of the material. Round objects tend to be choking hazards. Is it hard? Is it sharp? All of those things might lend to an injury. What's the location in the product? Is it visible to the consumer? Is it not visible to the consumer? All of that will help inform your risk determination. And so then, just to kind of lighten it up a little bit, to talk about the intersection of hazard and risk. I've got like a pretty basic and obvious example. So when you think about whether it's a hazard, and so think about all of the things that were in the list on the preceding slide. You may determine that something is a hazard, right? Sharks in the ocean are a hazard, but they're only a risk if I'm also in the ocean with the sharks. And so, the hazard being in the product in and of itself, you may be able to mitigate that hazard before there's an exposure to the consumer. And so, the main thing here is really to emphasize the importance of keeping control of any hazardous material and then applying the appropriate response or disposition to that material. And so when we think about the disposition, this is really the third component of the response. And so, you have options depending upon where you identify the problem. And I've got internal business to business, business to customer, business to consumer on here. We'll talk about those, but for the purpose of what we're talking about today, we're really going to focus on the rework angle. But when you think about what your options are, obviously you can decide there's nothing to see here. It's not a problem. That would be the release or the reassurance component. There's a rework component. We do have a problem and we have the ability to do something about it. That's the rework. And I will say, if we look at the business to business blank, that rework It may be a two-part thing. You might need to retrieve it and then do the rework. That could be an option. Same with business to customer. You may have that ability as well. But what you do with that is going to be determined by the object's classification and the risk to the end user. You're going to want to understand whether the problem is isolated or if it's a systematic issue. If it's isolated, maybe you found something, maybe there's a contaminant in the product and it's the only one. And you know that's the only finding that there's going to be. That's not to say that you don't do anything else to spot check that decision, but that may be where you decide. You also may be concerned about the controls that are in effect wherever the product physically sits. How much confidence do you have that you're going to be able to maintain control of the product while you're working on the remediation of the problem? All of these are important considerations. And so then moving on to the rework options. So let's assume that we've settled on we're going to rework the product. You've got a couple of choices. If it's internal to your process, then certainly you can try to determine whether you've got the ability to do that via an inline or an offline process, whether you're going to use manual labor, human eye, or whether you're going to use some sort of technology to help identify and screen out the problem, or you can utilize a third party. This is a good option, the third party, when the product's already there. It's already, or you have the ability to ship it to wherever that is. And so, thinking about that, there are also some challenges to rework, unfortunately, and these inform our decisions, as we work through these. And so I would say, time, labor, technology, location, all of these ladder up to your ultimate decision and must be considered carefully to figure out what you're going to do. So let's take a deeper dive into each of these, starting with time. So you have this rework. I would guess that most of our businesses, I know mine does, runs off of a production schedule. We have orders that we're working to. We know what we're trying to produce, and someone is determining when we're going to produce those things. And it typically doesn't account for time baked in for us to start over and retry something that we've already produced. Additionally, thinking about our customer expectations, I know most of my customers have expectations that the product that they order is going to be delivered on time in full. And so, we disappoint our customers when we can't meet that schedule. And so, factored into both of those things, then what's the reasonable speed that you can conduct this rework in your facility in consideration of whatever that customer or whatever that production schedule is, paired up with the customer expectations for when they're going to receive the product. So that's number one, time. And then that takes us to labor, being the next piece. And so how complicated is this rework process going to be in your location? So let's assume that you've got the ability to do it, maybe in-house. How complicated is it going to be? Do you have the labor to do it? And back to consideration of that production schedule, if the answer is, well, we'll have to do this rework over the weekend, 6th and 7th day work, whatever that is outside the schedule, then what's that cost going to be? And is the juice worth the squeeze to try to rework it yourself? Next piece would be technology. And so when we talk about technology, we're obviously assuming that you're not going to go with manual screening, sorting, reliant on the human eye. There are a lot of possibilities there. Maybe you've got magnets, filters, screens, metal detection, hyperspectral imaging, X-ray. I think the important consideration here is what is the what are you looking for, and what's the ability of whatever you're using for that technology to detect what that thing is. So just because you've got this technology online, there are a whole lot of factors that influence detectability of materials, and all of those need to be followed up on and to make sure that what you're trying to do will actually accomplish the end result. And we could probably spend a whole nother hour talking about those specifics, but we won't belabor that here. Just know that that's an important piece that you need to follow up on. And then finally, location. So where does this product physically sit? And, how easy is it for you to get your arms around it to rework, assuming you're able to, or send it to a third party? Can it be screened, sorted where it is, or does it need to be relocated somewhere else? If it needs to be relocated, there's probably a cost benefit analysis that goes in there to help make the decision on what the right thing to do is. And then, of course, the pinnacle, what's your comfort level with your ability to keep your arms around the affected product while all of this is going on, and you're working through the rework. And so with that in mind, we'll transition and talk through some examples of causes of rework. And so I'll pitch it back over to Seth.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. Now we're going to talk through some common rework causes within the food industry, with an emphasis on foreign material. So in order to talk foreign material, let's talk about metal detection and a metal detection failure, to be more specific. Metal detectors being a very important part in most HACCP plans. They're the end-of-line CCP for most lines within the food industry. So whether it's a missed check or a metal detector failure, one thing can be certain for sure: you'll have product on hold. With this failure, though, you'll have a pretty easy set of bookends. You know when your last good check was, and you know when your failure happened pretty much instantaneously. So what are the options that you have when you have a metal detector go down or you missed a metal detector check? Most production facilities don't have an extra line just laying around or an extra metal detector that they can, wheel that product over to and run it through the extra line. So you got to utilize the lines that you have. So that means missed downtime, like Suzanne spoke about, potential delivery issues and being on time with orders, and as well as constraining your labor. Another option that you might have, though, is being a third-party detection service, where you could send your product to them and they could detect it for you, and then you can continue running on the lines that you have.
I think I would just add to this, Seth brings up an important point that most facilities don't have just extra lines laying around with metal detectors on them. And so when you're considering what to do from a rework perspective, you want to make sure that you consider the sensitivity level and the size of the aperture in relation to your product, to make sure that you're doing the right thing and it's equivalent to what your normal, equivalent or better than what your normal setup is that missed on the first try.
Yeah, great point there. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide, let's talk about mechanical failures. Mechanical failures can lead to foreign material contamination and are definitely a growing concern within the industry as we continue to automate processes. You have more machines over your product contact surfaces than ever before. So once a failure is noticed, let's use the example of a sifter screen being broken and pieces were found missing during a routine check. So once you've found this failure, you have to find your bookends, and you can use the procedure that Suzanne has outlined just previously. You're going to assess your risk, and then you're going to create a hold. So once your hold is created, you got to figure out how we're going to sort through your material to find the broken pieces of sifter screen. You have a couple options. You can utilize your inline detection, whether that's an inline X-ray or metal detector, and hope that it's able to find all of the missing pieces. You, of course, can add labor and manually sift through that process and see if you can find missing pieces by hand, assuming that they haven't been mixed into the product and embedded. Of course, you can always throw the product away and start over. Or third, you could utilize a third-party inspection service, so that way you're not taking line downtime or utilizing labor to do a manual sort.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I would add here is, if you're going to try to detect in-house or out of the house for that matter, I think it's really important that you verify that in either case, the detection equipment that you're utilizing can detect the thing that you're missing. I think, it would be a bad idea to have like blind faith in your detection equipment that it's capable of detecting the pieces at whatever size that you're missing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, Suzanne, that you bring up, because not always is a mechanical failure related to metal for that instance. So we're utilizing a lot more plastics and polymers in our manufacturing process than ever before. So those things are hard to detect. Okay, jumping into foreign material, starting out with bone. Bone is not a foreign material from a USDA standard, but when we're talking about boneless meat products, it can present a risk to your customer and can lead to complaints. So bone can be introduced into the meat process at various points, starting with the deboning line. So whether you're utilizing automated deboning or you have personnel physically cutting the bone off the meat, if the blade nicks the bone, you can get some bone in your meat. Moving on down the process though to where you grind and utilize bone elimination process. So if your grind is set up incorrectly or you grind too much bone, sometimes it's too much for the bone eliminator to be able to keep up with. And of course, lastly, if your machinery is not set up appropriately, you miss some plates putting them in or have the wrong size grind plate in there, it could lead to bone being in your process. So once you find bone in the product, how do you determine your bookends? Is the entire lot going to be on hold? And if so, what do you do to inspect for that material? As everyone knows, metal detectors do not detect bone. So what options do you have then? Can you do a manual sort? If it is large pieces of bone, that might be possible. Or can you utilize some sort of X-ray technology, whether it's in-house or third party? Continuing on the vein of foreign material, talking about foreign material that's non-metal. So across the food industry, you have various entry points of non-metal foreign material to happen within your process. Whether we're talking about PPE from your operators, simple safety glasses breaking or gone missing, to rubber belting or scraper blades that are that are an integral part of your process. Each industry can be loaded with a lot of things that the standard metal detector cannot detect. So when you come across these things, how can you find them when you know you have a foreign material issue that's not metal detectable? First portion would be just manual labor. Can you get people involved to sort through your product to see if you can find this foreign material, or do you have to trash it? What other options do you have? X-ray technology is growing and becoming better. So some of these things can be found through X-ray technology, whether it's in-house or with a third party.
Yeah, and I think I would just reiterate one more time the importance of making sure that the equipment you're using is capable of detecting whatever you're looking for. I think the other thing that I would add here is just a caution with people doing the rework, because people all come with attention spans that may or may not be very long. And I think even the most attentive person, you kind of gloss over after a period of time looking at what feels like the same thing. Maybe there's also a method of, whether you can feel it in handling the product, if that's even possible. But there's a lot of pitfalls in here. But the main thing would be, can you actually detect whatever it is that you're looking for?
I think the size of what you're looking for adds to your point there as well. If it's something really small that it's really hard to see, then is manual even an option for you? The last thing I'd like to touch point on from a foreign material event would be metal. So the vast majority of all of our production lines are made with a lot of stainless steel. It's a favorite with the quality departments and engineering teams across the industry because it's easy to clean, corrosion resistant to the chemicals that were used to ensure cleanliness, as well as it's a very mechanically strong material. Utilizing an example of during a routine check that you find metal rubbing on metal, creating small metal flakes and metal dust. This could lead to a very large hold, specifically if it's not a routinely checked area, or in my mind, I think of it, you find that pre-op. So if you're doing a pre-op and you find that you've had a lot of metal a lot of metal rubbing that could potentially cause some contamination, how often are you looking at that area? Could be once a week, could be once a day. That could lead to a very large hold in terms of creating your bookends to determine when the last time it was a good piece of equipment to the time you found that it was rubbing. First thing you need to determine now, after you've established a hold, would be, is your standard end-of-line metal detector capable of seeing what you're looking for? Or is this going to be too small of a metal flake for it to see? At this point, you're left with two options. Either increase your technology and utilize something better like X-ray, or trash the product. The last example I want to talk to that could be a result of foreign material or just a lack of knowledge if it's foreign material free would be missing a CCP check. So we've all had operators that have gotten busy and either missed a check completely or have gone over the time limit that's stated within your HACCP plan. So when this happens, of course, we're going to have a hold generated and some rework is going to come out of that hold. So going back to the first example of a metal detector failure, would you have free line time to be able to rerun this product back through the CCP that you missed a check on? And is it possible to manually do offline, or do you have to utilize your line time? Not to beat a dead horse, but not everyone has a spare line to be able to do this again. Again, the other option could be, of course, a third-party checking.
Hi, I'm William Weishult. I'm the Director of Marketing for FlexXray, and I want to thank Suzanne and Seth for that very informative presentation. I would like to also thank all of the attendees for participating in today's webinar and hope you found this information helpful. FlexXray is here to help with your foreign material contamination needs. We are independent third-party inspection services and we have 4 locations across the United States to offer you solutions when you have issues. Now, we will turn this over to the Q&A section of the presentation.
Thank you so much, William. And thank you all for your attention to today's presentation. Just going through our Q&A briefly here at the end. So the first question that we have, and Seth, we'll start with your answer to this, is when an issue is identified during processing, would it be best to hold the entire production for re-inspection?
Yeah, so I think this kind of would depend on the issue that was identified. Most often not, the entire production run does not need to be held if it's a one-off instance. But like Suzanne kind of gave in earlier, we got to identify bookends. So the most important piece is, when do you know the problem started? And if you don't know that, we got to figure out when the problem did start to be able to identify how much product needs to go on hold.
Absolutely. Suzanne, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Seth covered it pretty well. I would just say, I think your investigation drives this. And so sometimes, as I said, you may want to hold more and then you can release along the way. It's a lot easier to do that on the front end than to come back behind and try to gather up what you can.
Gotcha. And if you have not yet taken the opportunity, folks, to post your question in the Q&A section, please feel free to do so. We're going to try and get to as many of those questions as we can. So next question, Suzanne, we'll start with you on this one. So with some of the issues with getting raw materials, a lot of these producers have had to start using different suppliers to ensure that they can meet production quotas. Do you have any recommendations for vetting suppliers from a foreign material contamination perspective?
Boy, do I. That could be a whole nother webinar. Trying to be brief here. I think, with any supplier, you want to know as much about their process as you can, and whether you get that information by sending them a survey, questionnaire, whatever that is, whether you have an audit process, whether you rely on third-party audits, whatever it is. I think you really want to understand as much as you can about their process so that you can assess that risk on your own end. And so I think, as much as you can know, I don't think it's possible to know too much.
Seth, anything to add to that?
I think Suzanne hit the nail right on the head. You got to be able to have trust in who your supplier is. So whatever you got to utilize to ensure you can have that trust, whether outside testing or even a site tour at that point, to ensure that they match your quality program too, is what you need to utilize.
Very good, very good. So in the eyes of regulators, how do they view X-ray and metal detection differently? Is there a difference in how those are viewed in terms of regulations, both by the regulators and the regulations themselves? Seth, we'll start with you on this one.
Yes, this is a detailed question. I'm not going to consider myself an expert from a regulation standpoint, but definitely it comes in line with your HACCP plan, which is government regulated, ensuring that you have all of your risks identified within the plant, and then you have to have end-of-line detection for any processed food that is consumed. So at the moment, that could be a metal detector or an X-ray. Maybe you can let Susan expand a little bit more on this one.
Yeah,
Suzanne?
but I think, what I would say here is that the important thing for any regulator is, have you removed the contaminant from the product, whether it's just a contaminant or whether it's a hazard. They're really most interested in the end result. So I wouldn't say that I've experienced that there's a preference. I think the important thing to remember here is, what are you looking for? And whether it's an X-ray or a metal detector, I mean, if you're looking for a hard plastic, the metal detector is not going to help you unless you've got like some kind of metal impregnated hard plastic or something. So it just needs to be fit for purpose for what you're trying to find.
So Suzanne, is it fair to classify X-ray tech as controller of an event versus metal detection as seen as informed view of an event? USDA sees any contamination as an adulterant, even if not seen as a hazard. What this question is referring to is 1 millimeter size metal. What are your experiences in that arena specifically?
Yeah, so my experience is that USDA doesn't want it in the product, and so however you can identify it and get it out is the way to go. I think depending upon, we talked a little bit about like the rate of finding. So whether it's an isolated sporadic thing or whether it's something that's happening all the time that may indicate either a systemic problem or some sort of event. I think the more things you find in your process and with increasing frequency, the more interested the regulators are going to be in that. And so, do I consider it a controller of an event or informative to an event? I don't know that matters so much as it is, how often are you having these findings? And does it indicate, are you reacting in your system? Does it indicate that there's something, maybe a bigger problem going on, or a persistent problem, I should say?
Absolutely. Seth, do you have anything to add on top of that one?
I think she did a good job explaining. The question asked around the 1 millimeter size example is that's quite a small piece for some of the metal detectors I'm used to. So increasing your technology, I think, will help you be able to find something that's small.
Yeah. So Seth, following up with another question, we'll start with you here. So can you address X-ray finding plastics as a foreign contaminant? Are you more likely to find metal and X-ray detectable plastics? Let you take that one away.
Yeah, so starting with the metals and metal detectable things, they're much easier to find with the X-ray as like they are with a metal detector. Under X-ray, the higher the density, the easier it is to locate. So when we're talking about plastics in general, it really is dependent on the media that it's within. So an embedded plastic in something that's very low density could be very easily seen under X-ray. But if you take that same plastic and put it under a higher density material, it might be actually invisible. So when it comes to plastics in general, 2D X-ray, it's really kind of making sure you do a sample test and understand what you're looking for to validate if you can do it. Now, if we're talking 3D X-ray, which is cutting edge technology, that issue starts to go away. You're able to see low density and high density plastics when you're able to start making a 3D model of what you're looking at.
Gotcha. Good to know. Suzanne, do you have anything to add specifically on plastics?
I don't. I think that was a great answer.
Yeah, that definitely fits with Seth. So Seth, a follow-up here. So this questioner has never worked with a third party for foreign material contamination. So what's the process that third parties like FlexXray use to find contamination that's different from what these producers can do internally?
Yeah, so I think the big determination is the type of technology. Speaking about FlexXray in general, with my knowledge, we use medical grade technology, which is very different than inline X-ray. That being said, our process is outlined. The first thing you do, you get a hold of a third party and say, hey, I have a potential foreign material event. We're going to request a sample of both the product and of the foreign material, if possible. And then we're going to take that sample and we're going to utilize the same technology that we would use for inspection to ensure that we can see that under that foreign material under X-ray. Once we determine that we can, then we'll then look at the size of material that we can find for you. So getting down to the smallest repeatable size that I know my team will be able to find for you is the number one goal in that sample testing. Once all of those stars align and we're actually inspecting the product at that point, then it runs very similar to kind of like what you see at TSA in the airport, right? So we have medical grade technology with human operators that are visually checking every individual package that goes through the machine. So we're watching the screens and identifying things that are not like the product itself. And so we can find whatever the foreign material is at that point. And if it's say you had a large or a large missing bolt, something that you only have one of, right? We can determine that right away, find that, and then stop the inspection and move on to the next one. Or if you have a systemic problem where you think you might have foreign material mixed in throughout the lot, then we can then obviously inspect the entire lot.
So Seth, I'm going to add a follow-up here. Suzanne brought to our attention the issue of human interest and human attention being a limiting factor for this kind of thing. How do operations like FlexXray ameliorate that and account for that and how they conduct operations?
Yeah, great question. Eye fatigue is something that anybody that's looked at an X-ray image will be aware of. So when you're looking at a monitor with grayscale, it tires your eyes out very quickly. So how we combat that is constantly challenging the operators from a seed check standpoint to ensure both the machine calibration and operator eye calibration, if you will. But then we also rotate our operators on and off the machine, from watching the screen to helping load and unload the conveyor and reloading boxes in case if it was out of case inspection for that matter. So from a FlexXray standpoint, our operators are only ever at the screen for 30 minutes at a time or less. So that kind of really helps with the eye fatigue standpoint. But then it lets everyone kind of wake up and go do something else. And then when they come back for their next round at the machine, they're already refreshed.
Excellent. Suzanne, this next question is for you. So this questioner asks, my customer X-rays my product after we make it. They have found isolated NAD, singular 1 millimeter pieces. As a result, it leads to USDA escalation. Response to that?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good time. I think that happens from time to time. Your customers do whatever sort of extra verification on your product. Maybe it's part of the process. I think there's two parts to this for me. One is I think we have to make sure that we understand what our customer is going to do with our product, so that we can be prepared for that and determine whether our process is capable to deliver to their expectations. That's probably number one. Secondarily, when you have those, as described, isolated, singular findings, I'm assuming these are super sporadic in nature. If that's the case, then perhaps it does go back to the, is this truly indicative of a contamination problem, or is your detection exclusion equipment, whether that is X-rays, whether it's metal detectors, whether it's magnets, filters, sieves, whatever it is that sort of like why you have that technology in the process? And so, certainly USDA and the FDA for that matter can be very interested in those findings, but I think, we have to stay rooted in what information is this providing us? Is it telling us that there is a bigger problem, or is it telling us that that we've had a one-off, something that's happened? So, careful coordination and then challenging conversations with regulators.
So for Seth, what is your probability of detection when re-inspecting product?
So when we do an inspection, we don't agree to any inspection unless we have a certain 100% repeatability of finding that foreign material. So I think they might be referring to maybe doing a gauge R&R study and trying to determine, what's their confidence interval. But our sample testing process is such that we align to a size of the foreign material within the product that we know we can find every time. So from a probability of detection standpoint, I stand behind them 100%.
All right. So this questioner asks, I hear at conferences about food safety as a culture, but I have never heard anybody talk about this and foreign material. Do you feel this should be part of that conversation?
Absolutely. Hands down, 100%. I think, our employees are a big influence in our foreign material performance, right? They're out there. I think I said in my section that they have the most information because they're closest to the work, and so we want them to do the right thing, not only in following our processes, our production processes, and managing their personal protective equipment and personal items and everything else. But we need them to understand that when they identify an issue, because again, they're right there out there on the production floor and nothing's going to get by them. We need them to do the right thing and be comfortable to raise their hand and say, hey, something's happened and we need to do something about it. And that's, 1,000% culture, and making sure that they feel safe to raise those concerns. And it's not going to be somebody's going to come down on their head about, you stop the line, or you are, influencing our production volume, or whatever it is, right? We all have the same mission. We want to put out good quality, safe product and a whole bunch of it, but it's got to be done the right way. So yeah, very, very important to culture.
All right. And that is all of the questions that we have time for today, and all the questions that have been submitted. If you have additional questions after this webinar, we encourage you to email Suzanne or Seth. They'll be happy to follow up. Their email addresses are on your screen, so you should be able to get those. Also, if you're looking to share this webinar with anybody, we will be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar later today or tomorrow, so that you'll have that in your inbox. And we encourage you to share that with any of your coworkers, colleagues who need to learn more about rethinking rework. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.